Let me tell you something about Isaiah before we get into the chapters. Most people who have heard of Isaiah know maybe one verse. For unto us a child is born. Maybe they know it from a Christmas service, maybe from a Handel concert. They think of it as a nice prophetic line buried somewhere in the Old Testament. That is not what this book is. Isaiah is 66 chapters long, written across roughly 40 years, covering the rise and fall of kings, the collapse of an empire, the destruction of a temple, the exile of an entire people, and a promise of restoration that stretches all the way to what many believers consider the end of time itself. It is, by a wide margin, one of the longest and most structurally ambitious books in the entire Bible. And here is the detail that changes how you should read it. 66 chapters. The Bible itself has 66 books. That is not something later scribes engineered on purpose. Chapter divisions were added centuries after Isaiah was written, by editors who had no idea they were creating this parallel. But generations of readers have noticed the pattern anyway, because once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah are heavy. They are about sin, judgment, the failures of kings, the threat of invading empires, the weight of a covenant being broken again and again. 39 chapters of confrontation. And the Old Testament, depending on how you count it, has 39 books. Books about law, about kings who failed, about prophets warning a nation that would not listen. Then chapter 40 arrives, and the entire tone of the book changes in a single sentence. Comfort, comfort my people. After 39 chapters of warning, Isaiah pivots into 27 chapters of restoration, mercy, a suffering servant who carries the weight of everyone else's failure, and a vision of a renewed creation. 27 chapters. The New Testament has 27 books. Grace after judgment. Comfort after confrontation. A servant who suffers so others do not have to. I am not telling you this to claim some kind of secret code was hidden in the text. Scholars argue about how intentional any of this is, and you should hear both sides before you decide what to make of it. But intentional or not, the shape is there, and once you see the shape, the whole book opens up. Isaiah is not one long prophecy. It is two movements: judgment, then comfort; law, then grace. And almost everything else in the Bible echoes that same two-part shape. So let's walk through it properly, not as one document, but as the three distinct seasons of one prophet's life. Isaiah began his work somewhere around 740 BC in the southern kingdom of Judah during the reign of King Uzziah. He tells us the moment his calling became undeniable, a vision of God enthroned, seraphim calling out, "Holy, holy, holy," and Isaiah responding not with confidence, but with terror. "Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips." This is not a man who applied for the job. This is a man who was overwhelmed by it and accepted anyway. A burning coal is pressed to his mouth in the vision, his guilt symbolically removed, and only then does he say the words that define the rest of his life. "Here am I, send me." It is worth pausing on why this opening scene matters so much for everything that follows. Isaiah's entire message is rooted in this one encounter with overwhelming holiness. He does not begin his career angry at his nation's politics or frustrated by foreign policy decisions. He begins by seeing, in a vision, exactly how far short of holiness everyone around him, himself included, actually falls. Every accusation he levels at Judah for the next several decades traces back to that single moment in the throne room. He is not condemning people from a position of superiority. He is condemning them from the position of someone who has personally felt how small, unclean lips makes you feel in the presence of something genuinely holy. What followed was roughly 4 decades of warning a nation that was not listening. Judah was caught between empires. Assyria was rising in the north, swallowing smaller kingdoms whole, building one of the most ruthlessly efficient military machines the ancient world had yet seen. The northern kingdom of Israel, Judah's own relatives, a divided nation that had split generations earlier after the death of Solomon, was destroyed by Assyria in 722 BC, its capital Samaria reduced to rubble, its population deported and scattered across the empire, never to return as a unified people again. Isaiah watched this happen in real time and warned Judah relentlessly, "You are next if you do not change course." The northern kingdom was not a distant cautionary tale to these people. It was their own family, their own shared history, wiped off the map within living memory. The political pressure on Judah's kings during this period was constant and exhausting. Smaller nations were forced into a brutal calculation again and again: ally with Assyria and survive as a vassal, or resist and risk annihilation. Isaiah's consistent message throughout these chapters cuts against both options that every other advisor in the royal court was pushing. He tells the kings not to trust in alliances with Egypt, not to trust in military buildups, not to trust in clever diplomacy with whichever empire seemed strongest that year. Trust in God alone, he says, over and over, to kings who found that advice almost unbearably impractical given the armies camped on their borders. But the warnings were not just political. Isaiah's central accusation against his own people was not that they had stopped performing religious rituals. It was the opposite. They were performing the rituals perfectly while the actual substance of their faith had rotted out underneath. Chapter 1 accuses them of bringing meaningless offerings, of multiplying prayers while their hands were stained, of caring more about feast days than about defending orphans and widows. This is some of the sharpest social critique in the entire Old Testament. The idea that you can do all the right religious motions and still be entirely lost. This theme runs much deeper through the early chapters than a single accusation in Chapter 1. Chapter 3 describes a society where the gap between rich and poor has become grotesque. Leaders who grind the faces of the poor while adorning themselves with jewelry and fine clothing, described in almost satirical detail. Chapter 5 contains a series of woes pronounced against specific behaviors, joining house to house and field to field until there is no room left for anyone else, calling evil good and good evil, being wise in your own eyes, acquitting the guilty for a bribe while denying justice to the innocent. None of this reads like ancient history when you actually sit with it. Here is something genuinely strange about the next section of Isaiah, and scholars have debated it for centuries. Chapter 40 onward speaks as if the exile has already happened. It speaks directly to a people living in Babylon, generations after Isaiah's own lifetime, addressing a crisis that, if Isaiah died around 700 BC, he would not have lived to see. Babylon did not destroy Jerusalem and haul its people into exile until 586 BC, nearly a century later. The temple Isaiah knew, the city he walked through, the kings he advised, all of it gone, burned, by the time this section's audience is actually living through the events it describes. Some scholars believe this section was written by a later prophet working in Isaiah's tradition, sometimes called Isaiah, someone writing from within the exile itself, addressing a community that desperately needed to hear that their punishment had a horizon. Others hold that Isaiah himself, near the end of his life, was given a vision that reached forward into a future he would never personally witness. His name attached to the entire 66-chapter work because the prophetic spirit behind it was understood as continuous, regardless of which decade physically wrote each line. Both positions have serious defenders, and this is genuinely one of the most contested questions in Old Testament scholarship. I am not going to pretend the debate is settled, because it is not. But here is what is not in dispute. Whoever wrote it, whenever it was written, this section is some of the most beautiful writing in the entire Hebrew Bible. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. After 39 chapters of confrontation, the tone breaks completely open. A voice crying in the wilderness, preparing a way. Every valley lifted up, every mountain made low. God's people, scattered and humiliated in a foreign empire, being told that their punishment is not the end of the story. Chapter 40 closes with one of the most quoted reassurances in the whole book. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength, will run and not grow weary, will walk and not faint. Spoken directly to people who, after decades in captivity, had every reason to feel that their strength had simply run out for good. This section also contains one of the most striking and concrete prophecies in the entire book. A named foreign king, Cyrus of Persia, identified by name in chapter 44 as the one God will use to bring the exiles home, decades before Cyrus existed as a historical figure available to be named by anyone. Cyrus did, in fact, conquer Babylon in 539 BC and issued a decree allowing the exiled people to return home and rebuild their temple, an event recorded independently in the books of Ezra and Chronicles. Whether you read this as a real-time prophecy stretching forward in time, or as a later writer naming the actual king under whom the exile had already ended, the message to a scattered and demoralized people is the same. Someone with no obligation to you, no reason to care about your particular God, will be moved to set you free anyway, because deliverance does not depend on your own strength to arrange it. And then comes the section that has shaped more theology than almost anything else in Isaiah. The servant songs, for passages scattered through chapters 42 to 53 describing a mysterious figure called the servant of the Lord. Sometimes the servant seems to be the nation of Israel itself, called to be a light to the nations, restoring justice on the earth. Sometimes the description is so specific, so individual, that it is hard to read it as a symbol for an entire people, a servant who is despised, rejected, who suffers in ways that seem to go beyond what a metaphor for a whole nation comfortably explains. Chapter 53 is the most intense of these passages, and it is worth sitting with directly. The servant is described as despised, rejected, a man of sorrows familiar with suffering, someone people turn their faces away from rather than look at. He is pierced for transgressions he did not commit. He is crushed for the wrongdoing of others. He carries the punishment that was supposed to land on someone else, and through that suffering, others are healed. He does not open his mouth in protest. He is led like a lamb to slaughter, and yet, the chapter insists he will see the result of his suffering and be satisfied. There is some kind of vindication waiting on the other side of the humiliation, even though the chapter never fully spells out what that vindication looks like. Jewish and Christian readers have long disagreed sharply about who this passage describes, whether it is Israel suffering through exile, a specific righteous figure, or something pointing toward the Messiah. Christian tradition has read this chapter as a direct prophecy of Jesus' death for nearly 2,000 years. That reading is central to the New Testament's own portrait of the crucifixion, quoted and alluded to repeatedly across the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament writings. Other readers, including much of historic Jewish interpretation, read the servant as representing the suffering and eventual vindication of Israel as a nation, a people who endured exile and humiliation on behalf of, or alongside, the rest of the world, and who would ultimately be restored. This is one of the most significant interpretive divides in the history of these texts, and both traditions deserve to be heard on their own terms rather than flattened into a single answer. Whatever you conclude about who the passage describes, the literary power of it is undeniable. It is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of writing about undeserved suffering that exists anywhere in ancient literature, which is part of why it has continued to resonate across so many different traditions and centuries, independent of which specific historical referent any one reader assigns to it. The rest of this middle section keeps circling back to themes of restoration and identity. Chapter 49 describes the servant being formed in the womb for this purpose before birth. Chapter 54 promises a future so secure that it is described as an everlasting covenant, comparing God's faithfulness to a husband returning after a period of having seemingly abandoned his wife. Chapter 55 closes the section with an open invitation. Everyone who is thirsty, come to the water, even those with no money, because what is being offered cannot actually be purchased anyway. It is an extraordinarily generous closing note to a section that began by addressing people who had every reason to believe they had been permanently cast off. The final section of Isaiah shifts again. The exile that chapters 40 to 55 anticipated is now being processed as something the people are living through and beginning to emerge from. The tone is forward-looking, almost apocalyptic at points, less about a specific return from a specific captivity, more about a complete remaking of how the world works. Chapter 56 opens this section with a surprisingly inclusive vision for an ancient text. Foreigners and outcasts who were previously excluded from full participation in worship are explicitly welcomed in, told that God's house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, not just for the people who had originally been given the covenant. This widening of who belongs runs throughout the closing chapters, pushing against the narrower, more exclusionary instincts that show up elsewhere in the ancient world's religious texts. There is sharp moral instruction here too. Chapter 58 contains one of the most quoted passages in the book, God rejecting empty religious performance again, this time fasting without justice, people going through the motions of self-denial while still oppressing their workers and quarreling with their neighbors. The chapter redefines what true devotion actually looks like, loosing the chains of injustice, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, not turning away from your own family in need. This is Isaiah circling back to the accusation he opened the entire book with. Religious performance without ethical substance is worthless, whether you are hearing it in chapter 1 or chapter 58. Whether the speaker is addressing a kingdom about to fall or a community that has already survived exile and is trying to figure out how to live faithfully afterward. Chapter 60 paints an extraordinary picture of restoration. Nations streaming toward a rebuilt Jerusalem, drawn by a light radiating from it. Wealth and resources flowing in from every direction. Gates that never need to close because there is no longer any threat requiring them shut. Chapter 61 contains the passage that, centuries later, a man would stand up and read aloud in a synagogue in Nazareth, applying it directly to himself. Good news for the poor, freedom for prisoners, comfort for those who mourn, a year of the Lord's favor. Whatever you make of that later moment, within Isaiah's own context, this chapter functions as the capstone of everything the middle section had been building toward. Total reversal, total restoration, oppression undone completely rather than merely eased. And then the book ends by reaching as far forward as it possibly can. Chapter 65 promises new heavens and a new earth, a world where infants do not die in their first days, where people build houses and actually get to live in them rather than having them seized, where wolf and lamb feed together, where the former troubles are not even remembered, where the very nature of conflict between creatures is undone at the root. It is one of the most expansive visions of total renewal found anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, reaching past any single political restoration into something closer to a complete remaking of how existence itself functions. Chapter 66 ends with both comfort and a final, sobering warning. Restoration for those who remained faithful, a promise that Jerusalem's children will be comforted the way a mother comforts a nursing child, and yet judgment still standing for those who did not turn back, described in language as severe as anything in the book's opening chapters. The very last verses do not let the reader settle into pure comfort. They insist that the same God who promises total renewal has not abandoned the demand for justice that opened the entire book's 66 chapters earlier. It is not a tidy ending. It is not meant to be. Isaiah closes the way most genuinely honest prophetic literature closes, pointing towards something not yet arrived, leaving the reader in the tension between what has already happened and what is still being waited for, between the comfort that has already been extended and the justice that has not yet been completely worked out. So here is the thing I actually want you to walk away with. Isaiah is not a single prophecy. It is the entire emotional and theological arc of the whole Bible, compressed into one book, written by one man, or one man and the prophetic tradition that carried his name forward, depending on which scholarly camp you find more convincing. Either way, it is a single sustained argument about how a relationship that has completely broken down can actually be repaired, and it makes that argument across nearly 700 years of historical events, from the Assyrian threat in Isaiah's own lifetime, through the Babylonian exile a century later, to a vision of total cosmic renewal that has not fully arrived even now. 39 chapters of a relationship breaking down. 27 chapters of that relationship being restored, at enormous cost, through a figure who suffers on behalf of everyone else. The exact same shape the entire Bible follows. The exact same shape that shows up in almost every story about brokenness and repair that human beings have ever told each other, in literature, in personal relationships, in the way people talk about recovery from their worst chapters. That is not an accident worth dismissing, even if you are not sure how intentional it originally was. Some shapes show up again and again because they are true to how restoration actually works. You do not get to comfort without first being honest about what went wrong. You do not get to new heavens and new earth without first sitting through the long, difficult chapters where everything fell apart, the corrupt courts, the empty rituals, the kings who chose short-term comfort over long-term faithfulness, the empire at the gates. Isaiah spent 40 years telling people things they did not want to hear, about a collapse most of them refused to believe was coming. He watched a sister nation get erased and tried to warn his own people they were not exempt from the same fate. He watched a king choose peace in his own lifetime over honesty about what was coming for his children. And then, reaching past his own lifetime, the tradition that carried his name kept speaking comfort to people living through exactly the disaster he warned about, because someone needed to tell them the story was not over, that a foreign king with no obligation to care about them would be moved to set them free, that a suffering servant would carry what they could not carry themselves, that wolves and lambs would eventually lie down together even though nothing in their present circumstances looked remotely like that was possible. Whatever collapse you are sitting in the middle of right now, whatever chapter 39 you feel stuck inside, I want you to remember that the same book that wrote your disaster also wrote your comfort. They are part of the same 66 chapters, the same story. You do not skip from judgment to restoration. You walk through both in order, the way Isaiah did, the way the people in exile did, the way every honest account of repair has ever worked. That is the story of Isaiah. I will see you in the next one.